I'd like to start by reading a little story to you. This is the story of Little Suck-a-Thumb, and this is from 1845. One day, Mama said, "Conrad, dear, I must go out and leave you here. But mind now, Conrad, what I say, don't suck your thumb while I'm away. The great tall tailor always comes to little boys that suck their thumbs, and ere they dream what he's about, he takes his great sharp scissors out and cuts their thumbs clean off. And then, you know, they never grow back again." Mama had scarcely turned her back. The thumb was in. Alack, alack. The door flew open, in he ran, the great, long, red-legged scissor man. "Oh, children, see, the tailor's come and caught our little suck-a-thumb." Snip, snap, snip, the scissors go, and Conrad cries out, "Oh, oh, oh." Snip, snap, snip, they go so fast that both his thumbs are off at last. Mama comes home, there Conrad stands, and looks quite sad and shows his hands. "Ah," said Mama, "I knew he'd come to naughty little suck-a-thumb." This is what is known as a cautionary tale. It's kind of horrific for a child, right? But this is what was told to children. A cautionary tale is a story that's meant to emphasize a moral lesson using graphic language to incite fear over what happens if you break certain rules or don't follow certain expectations. And as inadvisable as it might be to tell children stories like this now, I think we've learned and grown a little bit, I would say that it actually pales in comparison to some of the cautionary tales that we find in the pages of Scripture. One of the worst, as I see it, is the cautionary tale of Moses. Now, when we think about Moses, we don't often think of him as a cautionary figure. He was a good guy, right? He was a good example. In fact, he was a type that foreshadowed the coming of Jesus Christ. But he absolutely is someone that we should read with a hint of warning. Unlike other cautionary tales, like the story of Little Suck-a-Thumb, the Bible tells cautionary tales that are far less horrific. They have an element of horror to them, but it's a really good balance of horror and hope. And when we read through these biblical accounts, we're often left with an appropriate fear of the thing we're being cautioned against, along with a healthy dose of grace and mercy and forgiveness that somehow maintains that desire that we have to stay away from the thing we shouldn't do, but doesn't paralyze us with fear towards inaction. And this is what happens in the cautionary tale of Moses. Just like little Conrad Suck-a-Thumb, who's characterized by his thumb sucking, Moses is actually characterized by one thing as well, though we might not realize it at first. Now, obviously, he was an amazing historical figure, an amazing biblical figure. He had incredible qualities about him. He was a good person. As far as it goes, we all have sinned, but he was a good person that led a good example. And there are a million stories surrounding his name that we can look to, even upon just thinking of the name Moses. Some of them might come to your mind, like the 10 Commandments, or the parting of the sea, or the plagues of Egypt, and the list goes on. But one thing characterizes not just Moses, but all of those things, because it was the destination that all of those things were leading to. And it's incredibly cautionary. This thing that characterizes Moses and all of the events of his life is the sin that kept him out of the promised land, which happened the second time that God brought water from the rock for Israel. This is like Cinderella not meeting Prince Charming. This is like Frodo not delivering the ring to Mordor. Or like Daniel LaRusso not getting back up and fighting Cobra Kai. Or C Company not saving Private Ryan, all mixed into one. This is epic. And several things make this story so incredibly bitter when we reflect on it that I think it deserves to be labeled one of the most intense cautionary tales in existence, though it still maintains a beautiful hope, as is typical of all biblical examples of cautionary tales. So today, what we're going to do is walk briskly through the life of Moses to see all of the things that led up to this pivotal moment, this one sin that kept him out of the promised land. And I think When we do this, it should cause us to see Moses in a new light and begin to feel just how devastating this event was. Then we're going to look at the hope that the end of this story absolutely begs for. It leaves you wanting, desiring, needing a hope. And as we walk through the events of his life, we should feel appropriate fear and caution towards our own sins, but ideally the hope that this story points to and begs for will help this cautionary tale be one that doesn't paralyze us, but instead causes us to feel actually extreme relief. So first we need a bit of a refresher on sin itself, or the anatomy of sin. It's the thing that all of us fight daily. It's so commonplace that sometimes I think we forget that there's actually a process to this. This is like a tactic of Satan, and this is a part of who we are in a way. It's a part of our lives, and so it becomes so common that we forget to analyze exactly what sin is, apart from just, well, it's kind of the things we do wrong. And that is part of it. But there's a lot more to it than that, even before it becomes sin. In James chapter 1, verses 14, he says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." So there's a precursor to sin before the action even takes place. We have desires. Many of us have very different desires, and a lot of these desires are fine in and of themselves in the right context. You could desire comfortability or stability or enjoyment. These are all fine things in the right context, but they're not fine in the wrong context, in the wrong place, or to the wrong degree. And these desires don't come from nowhere. They're not just, well, we each get handed a few of them before we're born. That's not the case. They are a product of how we're raised, even sometimes our genetics or what we've lacked or experienced in life, maybe even our fears and our hopes. Let's call these things pre-existing conditions. That's what we're going to look at in the story of Moses, but I think we can kind of relate to that term, pre-existing conditions. It's the things that lead you closer and closer to be able to be tempted in the first place. Not necessarily wrong, but starting to head in that direction if put in the wrong context. It's when these desires begin to tempt us towards allowing them into the wrong context that we have a real problem. This tempting, I'd like to call the condition. It's the thing surrounding whatever sin happens at some given moment. You have desires, you have things that you wish for and you want, then you're tempted by those things, then you act on those things. This tempting is going to be called the condition throughout the rest of this message. It's the thing that draws our attention or our focus and lures us in to desire either things to the wrong degree or at the wrong time or for the wrong thing altogether. And this is often the place that Satan is the most involved. He tempts us. He is the tempter. Actually, that's what James is talking about in chapter 1. He says, God's not tempting you, right? You have desires, and you are led away by those desires when you put them in the wrong place. Then after all of this happens, we sin. So it takes all of that to lead to sin. So as we look at the events in Moses' life, let's look at his pre-existing conditions, which is what we're going to spend a lot of time in, and the condition itself surrounding that one sin that kept him out of the promised land. And I think we'll understand him a lot better, and we'll actually pity him in a way we might not have before. If you would, turn with me to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, we're going to begin reading in verse 8. Now this is before Moses is even born. So some of his pre-existing conditions that might play a factor into the sin he commits might have actually started before he was even alive and aware. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 says this, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So a few things to note here. One, they're not slaves from the get-go. This is an ongoing process that happens. They start out as free to live in Egypt. This new Pharaoh comes in. He doesn't like their numbers, and so he begins to strip away their rights little by little, strip away their freedoms until he finds the more that he oppresses them, the more he takes their freedom away, the more they're actually thriving in their numbers. And then he causes them to work as slaves. So first it's taskmasters. Yeah, well, your indentured servants will pay you. But as time goes on and they begin to multiply more and more and more, the oppression gets worse and they become slaves and their lives are bitter. They're slowly beaten into submission. They're overpopulated at this point because they're relegated to a certain corner of the nation when they become fully slaves. Their lives are difficult. In verse 15, we read about the genocide of the male Hebrew children. And then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank." Imagine the stress that this woman is under. Her nation is slaves. She has just committed an illegal act that could get her and her whole family put to death. Absolutely the death of her child, but perhaps the death of her whole family. And she has to live with that for 3 months before she does anything about it, because at that point, she's out of options. She can't hide him anymore. Now, how does this relate to Moses? Yes, this was rough on his mother, but how does it relate to Moses? They didn't actually know about this then, but now there are studies done in the field of something called epigenetics, which is a study that shows just how much traumatic experiences in the lives of a parent can affect a child's genetic makeup. They've done studies on Holocaust survivors that had children, and often those children are born, even though they might live good lives, they're born with a fear or even some sort of reticence towards things, a reservation, just because their parents were like that. And some of it is absolutely in how they're raised, because the parent went through something traumatic and teaches their child, you don't want to live like this, but some of it is actually found to be at a genetic level, according to Dr. Rachel Yehuda from Veteran Affairs Medical Center, who conducted this study over decades. So this is something that he's being born into. This is the life that he's being born into. And even at a young age, it could have affected him even genetically. In Exodus 2, verse 10, if you'd like to read there, it says, "When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" This probably means that Moses lived with his actual mother until he was about 3 or 4. Historical studies show that Egyptian and Hebrew culture was very similar on the time of weaning of a child, and it was about 3 to 4 years of age. And so Moses can talk at this point. Moses can hear songs at this point. He can learn a little bit about his people, and yet pretty soon he's going to be ripped away from his family and have knowledge of that. Not full knowledge, the knowledge of a toddler, but even so, that is traumatic for a person. Now, adoption is a wonderful thing, but when you're aware of it, it can cause a lot of difficulties if it's not handled with care, or you're not going into a good and loving home, which it seems fortunately like he was. The Pharaoh's daughter treated him well, but he had this torn identity of, do I belong here or do I belong here? That's something that can really, really mess with a person, especially when you consider how at odds Egypt was with Israel. And we know that he's aware of this because in Exodus 2:11, it says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens." So he knew that these were his people, and he had to watch every day as they were oppressed, and yet somehow still live in a family with Pharaoh's daughter that loved him and raised him well. We're told later in the Bible that Moses was wise and taught in all kinds of amazing things. He was possibly a military leader, according to Josephus. So he was given a lot of benefit, and yet some part of him, his heart, is still tied to the Hebrews. He's got this division of his identity. So he's not quite Hebrew, but he's not quite Egyptian. Then in verse 11 through 12, or I'll just read in verse 12, after he had seen an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. That, to me, points to meditated murder. It wasn't just an act of rage. He looked, is anyone going to see me do this? Can you imagine the stress that a person would feel? They actually say that when murderers get caught, they sleep the greatest sleep of their life in prison the next day because they can't be hunted anymore. Moses has just set himself up to be hunted for breaking the rules, for committing a crime. He's kind of taken a side at this moment. Am I Egypt? Am I Israel? I don't know. But he kills an Egyptian. That seems to make the decision for him. So you'd think, okay, he's a part of Israel. He's chosen his side. But that's not the case, because immediately after this, he sees two Hebrews struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" He took his side with Israel, and they didn't want him. In fact, the very fact that Pharaoh knows that he killed an Egyptian shows that the Hebrews betrayed him. He looked around. Is anybody here to see this? The only ones that would have known are the Hebrews, and they went and told Pharaoh. So he doesn't know where he belongs, and nobody really wants him. In Acts 7, verse 25, there's a really interesting statement in Stephen's address before the Sanhedrin. He says, in verse 25, it says, he supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. There's some historical records that say that Moses' name, meaning drawn out, was actually turned into some form of prophecy, meaning he was going to also in turn draw Israel out of Egypt, or help to do that by God's hand. So he seems to be at least in part aware that he's got a calling, a responsibility to these people. But they had no knowledge of it, or at least didn't care, or didn't trust him. Exodus 2:22, he flees into Midian, into the wilderness. He actually finds a modicum of comfort there, in the sense that he doesn't belong anywhere, so he might as well belong to the wilderness, which is essentially nowhere. And he names his son Gershom, because he has been a sojourner in a foreign land, or a stranger in a strange land. So this, I think, indicates how Moses feels. And we look at this and say, well, he's a stranger in Midian. I think Moses was, in an all-encompassing way, feeling like a stranger in a strange land. He was not an Israelite in Israel. He was not an Egyptian in Egypt. He was not a Midianite in Midian. He was no one from nowhere, claimed by no one. I think it's kind of bitter that he names his first son that, out of respect for this feeling. In Exodus 3, we see that Moses interacts with God. We'll start reading in verse 13 if you'd like to follow along. God commands him to do certain things. Moses is hesitant, he's skeptical, he's not even fully aware, like, what is happening right now? I mean, being within that proximity to God would have been a fearful thing, especially for a person that, what does he really know about God? And now he's being presented with God in the burning bush. In verse 13 it says, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So we're posed with this question here of, what does Moses, before this moment, know about God? He might have had some knowledge. He could have been 3 or 4 when he was taken from his Hebrew home and put into the Egyptian household. So he might have been taught the stories, the commands, the general idea of who God is and what he expects of his people, that they're set apart, that they're different. But 3 to 4 is not a long time to learn that much about him. Whereas in Egypt, he had years, up until the age of 40, to learn about all of their gods. And he was considered in their culture to be a very wise man. And in that culture, you can't be a wise man if you don't have an understanding of their religious system. It's so intertwined with their day-to-day life. So Moses was probably more familiar with pagan gods than he was the true God. Not to say he had no knowledge at all. When he flees into Midian, Jethro is called a high priest. What does that mean? Well, is he a high priest of the true God or pagan gods? He's kind of a very interesting figure in this way. Historians think that the Midianites, they're descended through Abraham a ways back, but they branched off and they went and lived in the desert. But they believe that they did have knowledge of the one true God, but they mixed it with other gods. So they worshipped Baal Peor on top of Yahweh. So they kind of had a bit of syncretism going on. So he could have learned some about the true God in this culture, but he didn't know that much. And so he's kind of at odds. When he meets God, I don't even know that much about you to begin with. And now I'm talking with you, being commanded by you. That would shake a person even if they felt they knew God really well. And it seems here in this section in Exodus 3:13-15, Moses is asking, okay, if I go back to them, they're not even going to believe me. You got to give me something to tell them that they're going to recognize about you that I don't already know. And God tells him his name. And so God sends this with him. He says, go back, tell them who I am, and then they will believe you. There's some tradition in the Talmud and the Mishnah that says that there was actually an old woman in the camp of Israel that had been secretly whispered the name of God, and she knew it. And so when Moses came back and he told it to the nation, she was the one that could confirm. I can't say any of that from the Bible at all, but that's kind of the idea here, is God says, go back, tell them this, then they will believe you. But Moses is unaware of this information prior to the burning bush incident. And then in Exodus 4, verse 10, we find out one more horrible thing about Moses. He has speech issues. Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant. So, listen, I couldn't speak well before. Now I'm seeing you. You think I can speak better then? No, I'm at a loss for words even more now than I was before. And God said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. Moses seems, in a lot of ways, set up to fail. But God has a task for him. He says, you who feel abandoned, return to those who turned on you. You non-Egyptian, go reason with the Egyptians like you're one of them, removing the entirety of the strength of their workforce. You non-Hebrew, lead the Hebrews who are suspicious of you. You murderer, return to the scene of the crime. You who found contentment in being lost in the wilderness, become the focal point. You who cannot speak, speak. You who are unfamiliar with God, be my prophet. You who are unfit for the task, accomplish it. Moses seems set up to fail. How is he going to do this? Now, obviously, God promises that he'd be with him. And in hindsight, we read this story and we see just how much God did. He was ever present the whole time. There was never a moment where he left Moses in the lurch. But from Moses' mind, looking forward, not knowing what's going to happen, it would be really hard to see the connection between what God promises he'll do through him and what's going to happen. Okay, so you're going to send me to Egypt, and I'm going to do some tricks, and then they will let people go. And God says, no, they're not going to let him go. He's like, well, then what are you even sending me for? How are these things related? How is this going to prove that they need to do this? They don't seem correlated. So I know you'll be with me, yet it kind of seems like it's all on me. If this isn't hard enough, in Exodus 4:24, God attempts to kill Moses. So that God you're supposed to trust that's going to be with you, now he's seeking your life. Now he did this, it seems to be related to the fact that he hadn't circumcised his son. Perhaps this neglect to circumcise his son shows some insight into how his relationship with God felt at the time. Yeah, I'm being used by you, but I don't belong to you. I don't have a relationship with you. I'm not in covenant with you. Why circumcise my son? That doesn't add up. I'm just a tool right now. And God seeks his life for this. So even in this, I think we can gain some sort of empathy for what Moses is going through. Yes, he was wrong in not doing that, and yet I understand why he might not have, if this is his mindset. In Exodus 5, God has entered into the story and taken an express interest in the Hebrews and in freeing them from Egypt. In Exodus 5:1, after Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may go and hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens." And at this point, Pharaoh doubles down on the oppression. He makes them work harder. He doesn't give them straw for their bricks. The quota is the same. So God's entered the story, and yet things have gotten a lot more difficult, a lot more complex. And this isn't just a lesson that God is teaching to Egypt. He's also teaching it to Israel. Remember who I am. So yes, God is the one orchestrating events here, and yet it seems like it's Moses that gets all of the negative consequences. He stands in God's place, and God actually says this, "You shall be as God to them." And Moses must have thought, well, maybe that comes with some power. It seems to come with a little bit of power and a lot of horrible consequences. Because the Israelites hate him because they say, "You have made our work harder. Why have you done this to us?" And Pharaoh hates him, saying, "Why do you trouble me? Why do you trouble the nation, seeking to take away our workforce?" And Moses sitting there saying, "Me? I'm just the mouthpiece. I'm just a guy talking to you." And yet he gets the blame. How is this fair? This period of Moses' life, and as we continue on, it cries out for an answer. We're familiar of the concept of someone standing in someone's place to take on their punishment. But a man doing this for God, that seems backwards. That seems wrong. And yet that's what Moses is tasked with doing. Moses is the center of attention, taking all of the abuse, all of the alienation, all the mistrust, all the embarrassment, knowing things in part and doing them, expecting some sort of positive outcome, and then God has a different idea, and it doesn't work out that way. God says, "Do this, speak to Pharaoh, tell him to let the people go." He does it, he doesn't let the people go, and Moses says, "Why'd you have me do that if you knew it wasn't going to work?" That would be a hard thing for a person to reason through. Reading through the story now, we see what God was doing, but Moses had no clue. He knew he was working something, but how and why in this way? No clue. His situation, just like the rest of Israel's, has gone from bad to worse. Before, Israel's traumatic experience was something that he was born into, but now it's his fault. Before, he longed to be part of Israel or Egypt or both, and now no one wants him. In Exodus 6 verse 9, it says this, "Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery." So God sets up a situation where their work gets harder and they refuse to listen to Moses all the more. How do you not feel like God's working against you at this point if you're Moses? Before, he was hunted down for murder, but he got to flee. Now, he's an enemy of the state for things that he didn't actually do himself. That's a lot for one person. In Exodus 7 through 12, we have the plagues. Now we're met with something totally different. So far, Moses has been between God and Israel, God and Egypt, Egypt and Israel, and now he's going to be between another imposing force. God turns the Nile to blood, which would have been a direct affront to the gods Hapi and Osiris, the gods of Nile and life. Heket, when he sent the frogs, would have been affronted. She was the goddess of fertility, water, renewal. She had the head of a frog. Geb was the god of the earth and the ground. So when lice comes up from the dust, this is showing God's power over that. Then there's flies against the god Khepri. Apis and Hathor against the livestock. Isis for the boils, the goddess of medicine and peace. Hail against the god of the sky, Nut. Locusts against Set, who's the god of chaos and storms, wind, and disorder. Darkness against Ra. And then the killing of the firstborn against Pharaoh himself, who believed he had the power to kill the firstborn. And now God showed him exactly who has that power. So not only is Moses challenged by his own upbringing and personal limitations, but he's often at odds with God himself, as well as the entire nation of Egypt, not just Pharaoh, but the entire nation now sees what he's done, and the Israelites. But now he's squarely at odds with spiritual forces too. These idols are not nothing. They're demonic entities, Paul tells us, and they were not unaware of what was going on. In Jude 1 verse 9, it tells us that the devil actually disputed with Michael the archangel over the body of Moses. They were watching all of this happen. They saw the attack. As focus went away from them and towards the true God, do you think they were happy about that? Or do you think they sought Moses' life all the more? He's literally against everybody at one point in time or another. Finally, we're getting close to the moment where Moses commits the sin that keeps him out of the promised land. But there are a few moments in the wilderness that I think also are really important for us to understand. I'm trying to paint a picture of the mosaic of Moses' life, some of the hardships he went through, put them in human terms, human perspective, to show just how ready he might have been to commit this sin. Just how his pre-existing conditions led to his condition that led to sin that led to death. So Israel in the wilderness, they've grumbled all the way. They'd seen some incredible things from God. He had turned bitter water drinkable. He had given them manna in the wilderness. He'd given them military victory over the Amalekites. But still, the grumbling came. And did it come against God? Not really. It was often to Moses. Why have you led us out of Egypt to die? Me? I'm trying to help. I'm trying to advocate between you and God. I'm trying to explain to him how what he's doing is making it harder for you. And I'm trying to explain to you that what he's doing is for your own good. But he gets the blame. That would be a hard pill to swallow. Turn with me to Exodus 32. Moses goes up the mountain to receive the tablets of stone with the law of God on it. And all it takes is a little bit of a delay. Look how ready they are to abandon Moses. Exodus 32:1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us," that's a hilarious command, up. Like, that is the high priest, and that's how you're going to talk with him. "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." Now this is interesting because the people are not only ready to abandon God, but also Moses, but they're ready to follow after foreign gods again. Aaron does an interesting little pivot here because they're saying, "These are the gods that brought you out." And Aaron says, no, we'll just worship this as the true God. So we're still focused on the real God. We're just going to worship him in a little bit different of a way. He says, well, I'll proclaim a feast to the Lord. And so what they're worshiping is a pagan idol set up to celebrate the true God. And so even in this, they're willing to go along with it. They say, okay, we'll do idolatry and we won't abandon the true God. So they're still more with God than they are with Moses in their act of idolatry of the golden calf, albeit in the absolute wrong way to worship God. In Exodus 32, verse 11, it says, after this, Moses comes down, he sees what's happening, he's furious about it, throws down the commands, and he says this, "But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand?'" So while they're saying, "Why have you brought us out?" he says, "O God who brought them out." All credit, all glory to God. Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent, did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from the disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all of this land that I have promised it I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever." And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. So he said, "Moses, I'm going to get rid of all of them. I'm just going to work through you now." And Moses, man, what a time to get rid of those who have hated you. What a time to say, you know what? They get what they deserve. They don't want me. They abandoned me in an instant. He doesn't do that. He pleads with God. He actually goes further in verse 30, which I think is astounding. I mean, already to plead with God in intercessory prayer and say, please don't wipe them out for your sake. But then what he does next is incredible. Exodus 32, verse 30. The next day Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin. And now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make an atonement for your sin. Wow. That sounds like, well, maybe I can just get God to forgive you. No. He already relented from the disaster, but their sin was still there, still prevalent, and atonement had to be made. And we know what atonement is. It's not a pleading prayer. It's death. Moses is offering to put himself in the place of the Israelites. That's significant. He says, but now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. But the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. So he offered to take their punishment on himself. So far, Moses has stood facing a lot of enemies. His own limitations, his own alienating upbringing, the oppression of Egypt, the people of Egypt that hated him for the plagues, Pharaoh himself, the scorn of the Hebrews who didn't trust him, powerful demonic beings. God himself at times was against Moses whenever Moses set himself against God. But he stood as the mediator of all involved parties and felt every ounce of derision and mocking and pain and mistrust and betrayal and confusion and antagonism. And if you want any proof that Egypt hated him as well, and not necessarily God, in Exodus 10:7, if we go back a bit, it says, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Well, it's God doing it, right? Yeah, Egypt recognized that. But who they really wanted taken out was this man who is a snare to us. Rather than Israel questioning God who brought them out, they questioned Moses and said, you brought us out to die. Rather than God scolding Israel directly, he scolded Moses and told him to deliver the message. Messengers get shot sometimes. And now, rather than have Israel face the consequences of their own sin, Moses is willing to stand in the gap between Israel and their sin and God and take the punishment on himself. These are the pre-existing conditions. This is what Moses is up against. These are the things that inform his desires, his actions, if he lets them get out of hand. So let's look at the condition of the sin itself. Turn with me to Numbers chapter 20. The people of Israel are still wandering. They've actually denied going into the promised land because it's full of enemies. They don't trust God. So God sends them back. They wander for a while. They're thirsty again. And they're complaining to who? To Moses. And God says, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out from this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. It's done. It's over. One moment, all of that, it's over. You don't get to go into the promised land. Now, many commentators have had a field day with this section, trying to parse out exactly what Moses' sin was. The Bible tells us exactly what his sin was. Moses acted unfaithfully towards God. Of course, he disobeyed by striking the rock twice, when instead he should have just obeyed God and spoken to it. And there's really interesting symbolism here with, Christ being the rock and Christ being stricken. But then after he's stricken, you can come and ask water of life freely from him. But aside from this, the reason that Moses had to face the consequences of his actions, that he couldn't enter the promised land, was because he, as the leader, took on himself the work that God was doing. Must we bring forth water from the rock. But think of how primed he was for this sin. Everything up to this point has caused negative consequences for Moses. He received nothing positive in return for his willingness to stand between various aggressing parties. You are the one who will draw them out. You must speak to Pharaoh. Why must you continue to plague us? Why did you make us work harder? Why did you bring us to the desert? And his response has always pointed back to God, shown God's greatness, and shouldered the blame, shouldered the responsibility, shouldered the consequences, until now when he says, must I bring forth water? You, I. One time. He's out. It's done. What's more, I think this is even worse. When Israel sins enough that Moses feels he has to go and make atonement for them, he readily does it. I mean, the next morning, he's back up the mountain pleading with God, saying, take me instead. When Moses sins grievously, where are the children of Israel on his behalf? Who offers themselves up for him? Who says, God, blot us out instead? We've sinned countless times. We've done what he did so many times. No one. It's silent. And this is why Moses' story is so bitter to me. He didn't make it. But it feels as if everything and everyone was working against him making it. This story to me cries out for fairness. It cries out for justice and for mercy. Moses, who did so much right, more than I could ever do in my lifetime. And if Moses can't make it to the promised land, how on earth am I supposed to make it? This is the crippling, paralyzing fear part of the cautionary tale. But as I said, the Bible's cautionary tales are not without hope. And this is the hope. Moses could only act as mediator between all parties for so long. Even as good as he was not an appropriate atoning sacrifice. If he wasn't an appropriate atoning sacrifice, certainly the people of Israel were not an appropriate atoning sacrifice for him. So where's the hope for us? How are we expected to make it if there's no way we could ever endure what Moses endured? Like I said, this story begs for the perfect mediator, a perfect atoning sacrifice, and it leaves that cry to resonate for thousands of years. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Start reading in verse 1. Now this is talking about ancient Israel and the sins that they had, but I think Moses is included in this as well. 1 Corinthians 10:1, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. That's not just Israel. That's Moses. He also was overthrown in the wilderness. He did not make it to the promised land. Verse 6, now these things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Hope number one, we have their story as an example of what not to do. Continuing on, verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Hope number two, we have the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ that covers what we've done and grants us access to that promised land. It might seem unfair and unjust that Moses had to take the blame for what God was doing or what the people of Israel were continuing to do in their sin, it might seem wrong that he took the heat for years and years. But this is just to show us that ultimately he couldn't take it. He couldn't be the one. He would fall to sin. We cannot stand in God's place indefinitely as we are. We cannot hope to stand where he is on our own merit. We are all going to fall. This is the cautionary tale part. But the part that cries out for an answer of justice and mercy eventually does and has come. Jesus stood in our place and never once wavered. Jesus stands currently in our place as an advocate before the Father. And Jesus stands in our place and took the shame and the ridicule and the embarrassment and the blame so that none of us could say, "Must we?" but instead so that all of us can say, "Look what he has done."